My name is Olivia Chen, and 3 months ago, I was a 35-year-old colonel with orders that seemed impossible to everyone who knew me. I was assigned to take command of Fort Hawthorne, one of the most prestigious military installations in the country, and the personal fiefdom of Brigadier General Victor Harrington, a man notorious for his old-school leadership and resistance to change. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I still remember the day the assignment came through. I was serving as a strategic operations officer at the Pentagon, having spent 15 years building a reputation for innovative thinking and effective leadership. My career path had been unconventional, degrees in cybersecurity and artificial intelligence rather than traditional military science. Multiple combat deployments where I'd implemented cutting-edge battlefield data systems, and a stint teaching at West Point where I'd challenged outdated tactical doctrines. Colonel Chen, my commanding officer, had said, sliding the assignment folder across his desk, "The Joint Chiefs want Fort Hawthorne transformed. Their cyber warfare division is stuck in the last century, and their integration with other branches is practically non-existent. They need someone who can drag them into modern warfare without breaking them." I opened the folder and saw Harrington's name. My heart sank. The general's reputation preceded him, decorated combat veteran, traditionalist to the core, and notoriously resistant to female officers in leadership positions. "Sir, with respect, General Harrington has blocked every modernization initiative proposed in the last 5 years. He's gone on record saying women lack the technological aptitude for cyber warfare. He'll resist my appointment at every turn." My CO leaned back in his chair. "That's exactly why you're going, Chun. The Pentagon needs Fort Hawthorne updated yesterday, and you're the best person for the job. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "Harrington doesn't know you're coming." That statement confused me. "Sir, the orders are classified until you arrive. Harrington thinks he's getting Colonel James Richardson from Aberdeen. You'll have 2 weeks on base as a visiting strategic advisor before your actual role is revealed." I stared at him in disbelief. "You want me to work under Harrington's command for 2 weeks without him knowing I'm about to become his commanding officer? Consider it reconnaissance. You'll get to see how the base really operates before Harrington can put on a show for the new commander. Plus, you'll identify your allies before the storm hits." The plan was unprecedented, possibly even questionable from an ethical standpoint, but I understood the strategic value. Still, the thought of walking into Fort Hawthorne, a bastion of traditional military culture, as an unwelcome visitor before dropping the command bombshell made my stomach twist. "When do I leave?" I asked, already mentally preparing for the battle ahead. "Tomorrow, Owen Chun." "Harrington doesn't respond well to direct challenges. Tread carefully." That night, I called my father, a retired master sergeant who had served 30 years. Unlike many military families, ours had no generals or admirals, no legacy of command. My father had enlisted straight out of high school and worked his way up through the ranks through sheer determination and excellence. "Dad, I got the Fort Hawthorne assignment," I said, still processing it myself. There was a long pause on the line. "Harrington's base?" "They're giving you Harrington's base." "Yes, but he doesn't know yet. I'm going in undercover for 2 weeks first." My father chuckled, but there was concern in his voice. "Olivia, that man is from a different era. His father was a general, his grandfather was a general. He believes command is his birthright. And I'm what? Just some officer who worked her way up from nothing?" I couldn't keep the edge from my voice. "You're a damn fine officer who earned everything she got," my father replied firmly. "But Harrington won't see it that way. He'll see you as a political appointment, a diversity checkbox. Then he's in for a surprise. Just be careful. Men like Harrington don't go down easily, and they don't fight fair." My father's warning stayed with me as my plane touched down near Fort Hawthorne the next day. The base sprawled across the landscape like a small city, its buildings a mix of historic stone structures and modern facilities. For over a century, it had been a cornerstone of American military power, producing generals and strategies that had shaped conflicts around the world. As I stepped off the plane in my dress uniform, a young lieutenant waited at attention. "Colonel Chen?" "Lieutenant Rivera, ma'am. I'm assigned to escort you to your quarters." "Thank you, Lieutenant. Has General Harrington been informed of my arrival?" Rivera looked uncomfortable. "Yes, ma'am. There's a senior staff briefing at 07:00 tomorrow. The General has requested your attendance." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Something in her tone told me this wasn't going to be the warm welcome committee. "Requested or ordered, Lieutenant?" A small smile touched her lips. His exact words were, "Get the Pentagon spy in my briefing room at 07:00 sharp." "I see." "And how did the General seem when he said this?" "About as pleased as finding sand in his boots, ma'am." I nodded, appreciating her candor. "Tell me about Fort Hawthorne, Lieutenant. The real story, not the brochure version." As we drove through the base, Rivera proved to be a valuable source of ground truth. Fort Hawthorne operated like a feudal system, with Harrington as its unquestioned lord. Senior officers were divided into two camps: Harrington loyalists who'd served with him for years, and reluctant newcomers who kept their heads down and avoided innovation. The base's cyber division, supposedly a priority investment, was understaffed and using outdated equipment and tactics. "The General believes in traditional warfare, ma'am," Rivera explained. "Boots on the ground, tanks on the field. He sees cyber as a support function, not a primary battlefield." "And the female officers?" I asked, noting the conspicuous absence of women in leadership positions as we passed various facilities. Rivera hesitated. "Limited advancement opportunities, ma'am. The General has traditional views about combat roles." We arrived at the visitors' quarters, a modest but comfortable building at the edge of the officers' housing area, far from the command center and notably isolated. "The General had you placed here rather than in the standard visiting officers' quarters," Rivera said apologetically. "Said you'd appreciate the privacy." Translation: He wanted me as far from the action as possible. "Is there anything else I should know before tomorrow's briefing, Lieutenant?" Rivera straightened her shoulders. "Ma'am, the General has a reputation for testing new arrivals, especially those from the Pentagon. He believes in battlefield experience over strategic theory." "I have both," I replied evenly. "Yes, ma'am, I know. Your work in Afghanistan implementing the integrated battlefield awareness system saved a lot of lives, including my brother's unit." She paused. "But the General may not acknowledge that kind of experience." After Rivera left, I spent the evening reviewing Fort Hawthorne's organizational structure, performance metrics, and personnel files that had been provided to me. The picture they painted was concerning: declining readiness scores, high transfer rates among junior officers, and a notable absence of technological modernization despite allocated funding. As the sun set over the base, I prepared my uniform for the morning and tried to get some sleep, but my mind kept racing. I wasn't naive. I knew the Pentagon had chosen me not just for my qualifications, but because they needed someone who would face resistance and push through anyway. I was being set up for a confrontation with a decorated general who had spent decades building his power base. My alarm went off at 05:00, though I'd been awake for hours. I dressed meticulously, ensuring every element of my uniform was perfect. If Harrington was looking for an excuse to dismiss me, he wouldn't find it in my appearance. I arrived at the command building at 06:45, 15 minutes early, and was directed to wait outside the briefing room. At precisely 07:00, the doors opened. The briefing room was filled with about 20 senior officers, all men, all watching me with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. At the head of the table stood Brigadier General Victor Harrington. He was tall, imposing, with silver hair cropped short and a chest full of ribbons that spoke to a distinguished career. His face was weathered from years in the field, with piercing blue eyes that sized me up immediately. I could almost see him, cataloging what he perceived as my deficiencies: female, Asian American, younger than most colonels of my rank. "Colonel Chen," he said, my name sounding like an accusation in his clipped tone. "Welcome to Fort Hawthorne. I understand you're here to advise us on strategic modernization." "Yes, sir," I replied, keeping my voice neutral and professional. "I appreciate the opportunity to work with your team." Harrington gestured to a chair at the far end of the table, as distant from the action as possible. "Please join us. Though I should warn you, we're discussing actual military operations here, not theoretical Pentagon exercises." Several of his officers smirked. The battle lines were being drawn already. I took my seat and listened as Harrington led the briefing. He was undeniably competent, with a commanding grasp of traditional military operations. But when the discussion turned to an upcoming joint exercise involving cyber warfare elements, his limitations became apparent. "Our cyber team will play a supporting role only," Harrington stated firmly. "Real victory is achieved by soldiers, not keyboard warriors." I made a note on my tablet but said nothing. This wasn't the time for confrontation. "Colonel Chen," Harrington said suddenly, all eyes turning to me, "since the Pentagon considers you an expert on these matters, perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts on the role of cyber operations in modern warfare?" It was a trap carefully laid. If I contradicted him, I'd be challenging his authority. If I agreed, I'd be undermining my own mission. "General," I began carefully, "cyber warfare is simply another battlefield domain, like land, sea, air, or space. In modern conflict, they must be integrated seamlessly, with each component receiving appropriate resources based on the specific mission parameters." Harrington's eyes narrowed, a diplomatic answer. "But tell me, Colonel, have you ever seen? What happens when a soldier relies on technology that fails? When your fancy battlefield awareness system crashes and men are left exposed to enemy fire?" "Yes, sir, I have," I replied evenly. "During my third deployment to Afghanistan, our forward operating base lost all communications during a coordinated attack. We defended our position using traditional methods while simultaneously executing cyber countermeasures that ultimately identified and neutralized the enemy's command structure." A flicker of surprise crossed Harrington's face, quickly masked. He clearly hadn't expected me to have direct combat experience. "An interesting anecdote," he said dismissively. "But exceptional circumstances don't dictate standard doctrine. At Fort Hawthorne, we believe in proven methods, not experimental technologies." "All technologies were experimental ones, sir," I replied, "including the radio, which revolutionized battlefield communications despite initial resistance." The room went silent. I'd pushed back, subtly but unmistakably. Harrington's jaw tightened, and I could see I'd struck a nerve. "Thank you for your insight, Colonel," he said coldly. "Now, if we could return to actual military matters." The rest of the briefing was a calculated exercise in exclusion. Harrington directed all substantive discussions away from me, occasionally, throwing pointed questions my way designed to highlight my supposed lack of practical experience. Each time, I responded with specific examples from my deployments, gradually establishing my credentials despite his efforts. By the end of the briefing, I'd made my point, but at a cost. Harrington's hostility was now open and unambiguous. As the officers filed out, he called me to stay behind. "Colonel Chen," he said once we were alone, "let me be clear about something. You're here because someone at the Pentagon thinks Fort Hawthorne needs fixing. It doesn't. We train soldiers to fight and win wars using methods proven on actual battlefields, not in think tanks or computer simulations. With respect, General, warfare has evolved. Our adversaries are fighting in digital spaces as aggressively as physical ones. If we don't adapt, he cut in, we'll still have soldiers who can fight when the power goes out. Can your cyber warriors say the same? The most effective fighting force can do both, sir. That's the point of integration. Harrington moved closer, using his height to intimidate. Let me give you some friendly advice, Colonel. Complete your assessment, write your report, and return to the Pentagon. Nothing is going to change at Fort Hawthorne under my command. I met his gaze steadily. I understand your position, General. Good, because I'd hate for your career to hit an unexpected obstacle. The military is still a place where reputation matters, and I have a long memory. The threat was clear, if technically deniable. I nodded once and left the room, my mind already racing. Harrington was worse than I'd expected, not just resistant to change but actively hostile to it, and willing to use intimidation to maintain the status quo. As I walked across the base, Lieutenant Rivera fell into step beside me. How was the briefing, ma'am? Educational, I replied. The general made his position quite clear. Rivera glanced around to ensure no one was within earshot. Ma'am, some of us were hoping. That is, there are officers here who believe in what you're trying to do. We're just not in positions to say so openly. This was interesting. How? Many, Lieutenant. More than the general realizes. Especially among the junior officers and the tech specialists. We know we're falling behind, and yet no one speaks up? Rivera's expression turned grim. The last major who pushed for expanding the cyber division was reassigned to a weather station in Alaska. The message was received. Over the next several days, I began a careful assessment of Fort Hawthorne's operations, focusing especially on its cyber warfare, capabilities, and integration with traditional forces. What I found was deeply troubling. Despite substantial budget allocations for technological modernization, much of the funding had been redirected to traditional weapon systems. The cyber division was operating with outdated equipment, understaffed, and marginalized within the command structure. More concerning was the culture of fear Harrington had created. Capable officers were afraid to propose innovations or challenge outdated methodologies. Those who did were quickly sidelined or transferred. The result was a base that looked impressive on paper, but was increasingly ill-equipped to face modern threats. Throughout this investigation, Harrington continued his campaign of humiliation and marginalization. I was excluded from key meetings, assigned an office in an administrative building far from the command center, and subjected to a continuous stream of subtle and not-so-subtle jabs about my background, expertise, and gender. During one particularly memorable incident, Harrington interrupted my interview with the head of communications technology, bursting into the room with several of his staff officers. "Ah, Colonel Chen, still hunting for problems to justify your presence?" he asked loudly. "Major Williams, I hope you're not being too accommodating to our Pentagon visitor. We wouldn't want her to think Fort Hawthorne needs fixing." "Just conducting my assessment, General," I replied calmly. "Yes, your assessment," he said, making the word sound like an accusation. "Tell me, Colonel, in your extensive experience pushing papers at the Pentagon, have you ever actually commanded troops in a real-world operation? Have you ever made decisions that put men's lives at risk?" The room went silent. It was a direct challenge to my legitimacy as an officer. "Yes, General, I have," I answered, keeping my voice level despite the anger building inside me. "During the Kamdesh offensive, I commanded a joint task force of conventional and special operations units when our commanding officer was killed by sniper fire. We completed our mission objectives with minimal casualties and extracted under heavy enemy fire." Harrington looked momentarily taken aback, clearly not expecting this answer. His recovery was quick, but noticeable. A temporary field promotion in an emergency situation is hardly the same as real command experience, he said dismissively. But I'm sure it makes for a good story in Pentagon briefings. The soldiers under my command didn't seem to find it temporary, sir, I replied. Nor did the Department of the Army when they awarded me the Silver Star. Harrington's face flushed with anger. He hadn't bothered to read my full service record, assuming that a female officer from the Pentagon would have a career of safe assignments and staff positions. His miscalculation was now evident to everyone in the room. We all have our medals. Colonel, he said coldly. Some earned through years of service rather than single incidents. Major Williams, when you're done here, I need you in the command center. After Harrington left, Major Williams looked at me with new respect. I didn't know about Kamdesh, ma'am. It's not something I advertise, I replied. But I don't appreciate having my service record questioned. The general was out of line, Williams admitted quietly. But he's been under pressure from the Pentagon for months. Budget reviews, readiness assessments. Now your strategic evaluation. He sees it as a vote of no confidence. It's not personal, I said, though we both knew that wasn't entirely true. The Pentagon's concerns about Fort Hawthorne were specifically about Harrington's leadership, his resistance to modernization, and his creation of a toxic command climate. As my first week at Fort Hawthorne progressed, I built a network of allies. Among the mid-level officers and technical specialists who recognized the need for change, Lieutenant Rivera proved invaluable, connecting me with key personnel who could speak candidly about the base's challenges without fear of immediate reprisal. What emerged was a portrait of a once great installation slowly losing its edge under leadership that valued tradition over effectiveness. More troubling were the accounts of qualified female officers and technological specialists being systematically sidelined, their careers stalling despite exemplary performance. Meanwhile, Harrington's campaign against me intensified. I was accidentally excluded from security briefings. My access to certain facilities was mysteriously revoked, and rumors began circulating that I was part of a Pentagon plot to dismantle Fort Hawthorne's combat units in favor of a computer lab. The situation came to a head during a base-wide readiness exercise at the end of my first week. Harrington had designed the scenario specifically to showcase traditional military strengths, while minimizing the role of cyber operations. Teams were evaluated on physical readiness, weapons proficiency, and conventional tactics, with minimal points allocated to electronic warfare or digital security. I observed from the sidelines, taking notes as Harrington narrated the exercise for visiting officials from nearby bases, repeatedly emphasizing how real soldiers train for real combat. His pointed glances in my direction made it clear who represented the alternative. During the after-action review, Harrington called on various unit commanders to report their results, conspicuously skipping Major Torres, who headed the undermanned cyber division. When the formal review concluded, I approached Torres. Your team wasn't included in the assessment, I observed. Torres looked frustrated but resigned. We never are, ma'am. According to the general, our contributions aren't quantifiable in meaningful metrics. What would you have reported if asked? Torres glanced around to ensure we weren't overheard. That during the exercise, we detected and blocked 3 simulated intrusions into the base's communication systems, identified a critical vulnerability in the command center's security protocol, and successfully infiltrated the opposing forces' battlefield network, giving us access to their complete operational plans, which could have significantly changed the outcome of the exercise, I noted. Yes, ma'am. But that kind of advantage doesn't look good on the general's highlight reel of traditional warfare. I was still speaking with Torres when Harrington approached, flanked by 2 of his most loyal colonels. Colonel Chen, he said loudly enough for nearby officers to hear, I couldn't help noticing your absence from the front lines of today's exercise. Too busy taking notes for your Pentagon masters? I was observing all aspects of the operation, General, I replied evenly. Including some elements that weren't included in your assessment. Harrington's eyes narrowed. Every relevant aspect of military readiness was covered in my exercise, Colonel. But perhaps you were looking for something else? Something that aligns with whatever narrative the Pentagon wants to hear. I could feel the attention of everyone nearby. This was a direct accusation of bias, a suggestion that my assessment was predetermined rather than objective. It was also an opportunity. Actually, General, I was noticing a significant gap in your integrated defense posture, I said calmly. Major Torres's cyber team identified and neutralized multiple threats to your command and control systems during the exercise, yet received no acknowledgement in your assessment. Computer games, Harrington scoffed, while real soldiers were training for combat. Those computer games prevented the opposing force from accessing your battle plans, I countered. In a real-world scenario, that's the difference between victory and defeat. Harrington stepped closer, using his physical presence as intimidation. Let me explain something to you, Colonel, since your Pentagon experience hasn't provided this. Insight: soldiers win wars. Courage, discipline, and training win wars, not keyboards and algorithms. With respect, General, that's a false dichotomy. Modern warfare requires both. Your soldiers showed impressive conventional skills today, but without effective cyber defenses, they'd be fighting blind against a technologically advanced adversary. Harrington's face flushed with anger. I've commanded troops in 3 major conflicts, Colonel. I've seen what works and what doesn't. Your theories about modern warfare might impress politicians and defense contractors, but they don't impress me. They're not theories, sir. They're battlefield realities I've experienced firsthand. Is that so? Harrington's voice dripped with sarcasm. Then perhaps tomorrow you'd like to demonstrate these realities. A small wargame scenario, your cyber approach against my conventional tactics. We'll see which is more effective. It was a trap, of course. Harrington would control the parameters, the evaluation criteria, and the narrative, but refusing would concede his point. I accept, General. On one condition, that we use standard Department of Defense evaluation metrics for integrated operations. Not just conventional ones. Harrington smiled coldly. Afraid of a fair fight, Colonel? Just ensuring the assessment reflects actual combat conditions, sir. Unless you'd prefer a simulation that doesn't match real-world scenarios. The challenge was clear, and Harrington couldn't back down without losing face in front of his officers. Tomorrow, 0900, main training facility. Bring whatever experts you can find. You'll need them. As Harrington walked away, Major Torres looked at me with concern. Ma'am, he's setting you up for failure. He controls every aspect of training operations on this base. Not every aspect, Major, I replied, a plan already forming. Gather your team tonight. We have work to do. That night, I gathered Major Torres and his cyber team in a secure conference room off the main grid. The room was small, poorly lit, and smelled of old coffee, a fitting metaphor for how cyber operations were valued at Fort Hawthorne. 8 specialists crowded around a table meant for 6, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Let me be clear, I began, looking at each of them. What we're about to discuss stays in this room. Tomorrow, General Harrington expects to publicly humiliate me, and by extension, all of you, to prove that traditional warfare trumps technological advancement. He's been doing that for years, ma'am, said Captain Rodriguez, a sharp-eyed woman whose personnel file indicated she'd been passed over for promotion twice despite exemplary performance. What makes tomorrow different? Tomorrow is different because we're not going to let him dictate the terms of engagement, I replied. Major Torres, pull up the base network schematic. Torres projected a complex diagram onto the wall. This is Fort Hawthorne's command and control infrastructure. Outdated in many areas but still functional. I studied the schematic carefully. What's the general's typical approach to these wargame exercises? Predictable, Torres said with a hint of frustration. Heavy emphasis on conventional force deployment, minimal electronic countermeasures, standard communications protocols. He runs the same basic playbook every time because it's always worked for him. And because no one's been allowed to seriously challenge it, added Lieutenant Park, the team's network security specialist. Anyone who exploits digital vulnerabilities gets accused of cheating rather than fighting realistically. I smiled. Then that's exactly what we'll do, fight realistically. In an actual conflict, the enemy doesn't follow your preferred rules of engagement. They exploit every vulnerability they can find. For the next 3 hours, we developed a strategy that would showcase the critical importance of integrated cyber operations without overtly humiliating the general, though I suspected his ego would take a significant hit regardless. When we finished, the team had a new energy about them. For the first time in years, someone in authority was taking their capabilities seriously. One more thing, I said as our meeting concluded. Whatever happens tomorrow, remember that our goal isn't to embarrass General Harrington, but to demonstrate the value of your work. This isn't personal. It's about the future of military effectiveness. Captain Rodriguez gave me a skeptical look. With respect, ma'am, it's already personal. For the general. He's been using these exercises to push his agenda for years. Tomorrow won't change his mind. I don't expect to change his mind, Captain. I expect to change the narrative. As the team filed out, Lieutenant Rivera, who'd been quietly observing from the corner, approached me. Ma'am, there's something you should know. Word of tomorrow's challenge has spread throughout the base. Several senior officers from nearby installations have arranged to observe. The general has been making calls, ensuring a substantial audience. This was both a complication and an opportunity. Harrington was gathering witnesses to my expected failure, but those same witnesses would observe whatever demonstration we could mount of modern warfare capabilities. Thank you, Lieutenant. That's useful information. After a few hours of restless sleep, I arrived at the training facility 30 minutes early to find it already bustling with activity. Harrington had pulled out all the stops, a full command center set up, tactical teams in position, and a gallery of senior officers from Fort Hawthorne and neighboring bases prepared to observe the proceedings. Harrington himself stood at the center of it all, resplendent in his battle dress uniform, surrounded by his most loyal officers. When he spotted me, he approached with a predatory smile. Colonel Chen, prompt as always. I trust you're prepared for today's demonstration? As prepared as your facilities allow, General, I replied evenly. His smile tightened. The parameters are simple. Your team will attempt to disrupt a standard field operation using your cyber capabilities. My teams will execute the operation using established protocols. Neutral observers will evaluate effectiveness based on mission completion metrics. It sounded reasonable on the surface, but I'd already spotted the trap. And the communication systems my team will be attempting to affect? Standard field equipment, isolated from the base's main network for security purposes. We wouldn't want any accidental damage to critical systems. There it was. He'd created a closed system that his technical staff had undoubtedly hardened against the most obvious intrusion methods. He was controlling the battlefield before the first move was made. Interesting approach, General. Not particularly realistic, but interesting. Harrington's eyes narrowed. Reality is what I say it is on my base, Colonel. The exercise begins in 20 minutes. As he walked away, Major Torres approached looking concerned. Ma'am, they've isolated the exercise network and loaded it with countermeasures. They've been working on it all night. Expected but disappointing, I replied. Proceed with our alternate strategy, and Major? Make sure your team documents everything meticulously. The exercise began precisely on schedule. Harrington's forces conducted a textbook operation, securing objectives, establishing communication lines, and moving with well-drilled precision. From the command center, I watched with Torres's team as they made several careful attempts to breach the isolated network, all of which were rebuffed by the enhanced security measures Harrington had implemented overnight. Across the room, Harrington was barely containing his satisfaction. Every few minutes he would glance in my direction, his expression growing more smug as the operation proceeded without digital interference. After 30 minutes, he approached our station. Troubles. Colonel, your keyboard warriors seem to be having difficulty making an impact. Perhaps reality isn't matching your theories. I checked my watch. The exercise isn't over yet, General. In fact, I'd say we're right on schedule. He frowned, clearly expecting me to be more flustered by our apparent failure. Your confidence is admirable, if misplaced. My operation is proceeding flawlessly, is it? I gestured to the large display showing the progress of his field teams. Your Alpha team is 15 minutes behind optimal deployment schedule. Bravo team has established an unnecessarily exposed communication relay. And your command decisions are being made with increasingly outdated intelligence. Harrington scoffed. Minor tactical adjustments, well within operational parameters. The mission objectives are being achieved systematically, but not efficiently, I countered. In a real-world scenario, those inefficiencies cost lives. Field commanders make adjustment decisions based on ground realities, Colonel, not theoretical optimizations. At that moment, Lieutenant Park signaled me with a subtle nod. It was time. General Harrington, I said loudly enough for nearby observers to hear. Would you agree that in actual combat conditions, an enemy would attempt to exploit any vulnerability, not just the ones you've prepared for? His eyes narrowed. Of course. Which is why we train for comprehensive security. Excellent. Then perhaps you can explain why, for the past 20 minutes, my team has had complete access to Fort Hawthorne's actual command network, not just your isolated exercise system. The color drained from Harrington's face. That's impossible. The exercise network is completely segregated. I gestured to the main display, where Torres activated our prepared demonstration. The screen split to show both the exercise data and, more alarmingly, live feeds from Fort Hawthorne's actual security systems, personnel files, and operations planning documents. Technically correct, General. Your exercise network is isolated. But you made a critical error in assuming that's where we would focus our efforts. In a real conflict, the enemy attacks your vulnerabilities, not your strengths. The room had gone completely silent. Every officer was staring at the display, where the extent of our access to supposedly secure systems was becoming clear. This is outrageous, Harrington sputtered. A deliberate security breach of this installation is grounds for court-martial. Not a breach, General. A demonstration conducted within authorized parameters for security testing, using only vulnerabilities that an actual adversary could exploit. I handed him a document. This authorization was included in my original orders from the Pentagon. Perhaps you didn't read the fine print. Harrington snatched the paper, his hands shaking with rage as he scanned the contents. This is a deliberate humiliation, a setup. No, General. This is modern warfare. I turned to address the room of stunned officers. While General Harrington's teams were conducting a textbook conventional operation, completely secure from digital interference on their isolated network, they were also completely blind to what was happening in the actual battle space. In a real conflict, they would have been operating with compromised intelligence, vulnerable communications, and exposed logistics. I nodded to Torres, who brought up a new display showing exactly how we had gained access through outdated software on non-military networks connected to base systems. unpatched vulnerabilities in routine administrative systems, and poor integration between security protocols. These aren't exotic zero-day exploits or sophisticated hacking techniques, I explained. These are basic vulnerabilities that Fort Hawthorne has failed to address despite multiple security advisories from Cyber Command over the past 18 months. The gallery of visiting officers was now paying rapt attention, many taking notes, or whispering to aides. Harrington's humiliation was complete and public, exactly what he had planned for me. "This proves nothing," he declared, though his voice lacked conviction. "A parlor trick designed to embarrass this command." "Not embarrass, General. Educate." I kept my tone respectful but firm. "Every vulnerability we've identified can be addressed with existing resources and proper training. Fort Hawthorne can maintain its excellence in conventional operations while significantly improving its cyber capabilities. That's the integration I've been advocating since I arrived." Harrington's face was a mask of barely controlled fury. "This exercise is terminated. All personnel, return to regular duties. Colonel Chen, my office, immediately." As the training facility emptied, the tension hanging in the air was palpable. I had publicly exposed significant security flaws in Harrington's command, but more importantly, I had challenged his authority and competence in front of his peers and subordinates. In military culture, there was no greater sin. Lieutenant Rivera caught up with me as I headed to Harrington's office. "Ma'am, the General is furious. Some of his staff are saying he's already contacted the Pentagon, demanding your immediate recall." "Let him try," I replied calmly. "Everything we did was authorized and necessary." "The cyber team is worried about retaliation," she continued. "Major Torres is already fielding calls questioning how the demonstration was conducted. Tell Major Torres to direct all inquiries to me." His team followed my direct orders. Harrington's office was located in the heart of the command building, a spacious room filled with mementos of his long and distinguished career. Battle flags, unit citations, and photographs with presidents and foreign dignitaries lined the walls. A shrine to conventional military success. He was waiting behind his desk, still visibly seething. "Close the door, Colonel." I did so, then stood at attention, preparing for the storm. "In 30 years of military service," he began, his voice dangerously quiet, "I have never witnessed such a blatant act of insubordination and disrespect. You deliberately undermined my authority, embarrassed this command in front of visiting officers, and compromised base security for your little demonstration. General Harrington, every action I took was authorized under. I don't give a damn what piece of paper you think authorized this." He exploded, slamming his fist on the desk. "This is my base. These are my soldiers. You are a visitor who has abused her position to push a political agenda." I remained outwardly calm despite my racing heart. "There's nothing political about addressing critical security vulnerabilities, sir. Don't play innocent, Colonel. We both know what this is about. The Pentagon wants to replace combat leaders with tech specialists, to turn the military into some kind of Silicon Valley operation. They sent you here to discredit me, to undermine everything I've built. That's not true, General. I was sent to assess Fort Hawthorne's readiness for modern warfare, which includes both conventional and cyber capabilities. The vulnerabilities we demonstrated today exist regardless of who's in command." Harrington came around the desk, standing uncomfortably close. "Let me be absolutely clear, Colonel. Your time at Fort Hawthorne is over. I've already contacted General Marshall at the Pentagon. You'll be on a plane back to Washington tonight, and your career will never recover from this stunt." I met his gaze steadily. "I don't believe General Marshall will see it that way, sir." "Marshall has been my friend for 20 years, Harrington said with grim satisfaction. "He understands how the real military works, not this techno-fantasy you're peddling." "Perhaps," I acknowledged. "But General Marshall isn't the final authority on this matter." Something in my tone made Harrington pause. What are you talking about? I reached into my pocket and withdrew an envelope bearing the seal of the Department of the Army. These orders were to be delivered tomorrow, but given the circumstances, I believe now is the appropriate time. Harrington snatched the envelope and tore it open. As he read, his face went from red to white. "This is impossible," he whispered. "No, General, this is the future." The orders were clear and direct. Brigadier General Victor Harrington was being reassigned to the Pentagon as a special advisor on traditional warfare doctrine. His replacement as commander of Fort Hawthorne would be Colonel Olivia Chen, effective immediately. "This is a mistake," he insisted, though his voice had lost its certainty. "A clerical error. It's not a mistake, General. The Joint Chiefs made this decision weeks ago. My advisory role was simply an opportunity to assess the situation before assuming command." Harrington stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. "You knew. This entire time, you knew you were replacing me." "Yes, sir." "And the demonstration today? That was what, your way of establishing dominance?" I shook my head. "That was my way of identifying critical vulnerabilities that need immediate attention." "How would you have preferred to learn about them? From me in a controlled exercise, or from an enemy in actual combat?" Harrington sank into his chair, the orders still clutched in his hand. "They're pushing me out because I wouldn't play along with their tech obsession. 30 years of service, and this is my reward." "You're not being pushed out, General. You're being reassigned to a position where your experience with conventional warfare can help shape doctrine integration. The military needs your knowledge, just not at the expense of ignoring new realities." For a long moment, Harrington sat in silence, processing what had happened. When he finally spoke, his voice was subdued but still bitter. "You won't last 6 months in this command, Chen. The culture here won't accept your leadership style or your priorities." "Perhaps not," I conceded. "But they'll accept results. And implementing proper cyber integration will deliver those results. And my staff? My loyal officers? What happens to them?" "That depends on their willingness to adapt. I have no intention of conducting a purge, General. I need experienced officers who understand this base and its operations. What I won't tolerate is active resistance to necessary modernization." Harrington gave a humorless laugh. "So that's the choice? Adapt or be sidelined. Decades of battlefield. Experience discounted because we don't worship at the altar of technology. No one's discounting experience, sir. But experience without evolution becomes obsolescence. The enemies we face today aren't fighting with the same tools or tactics they used 20 years ago. Neither can we." He stared at me for a long moment, then looked away. "When do you want my office cleared?" "There's no rush, General. The official change of command ceremony isn't scheduled until next week. In the meantime, I hope you'll consider helping with the transition. Your institutional knowledge would be invaluable." Harrington stood up slowly, his posture rigid with military discipline despite the shock he'd just received. "I'll comply with my orders, Colonel, or should I say General Chen? But don't expect me to celebrate the dismantling of everything I've built here." "I don't expect celebration, sir. Just professional cooperation." As I left Harrington's office, the weight of what had just occurred settled fully on my shoulders. I had effectively ended the career of a decorated general, one who had served his country honorably for decades. That he had resisted necessary change and created a toxic command climate didn't make the moment any less solemn. Lieutenant Rivera was waiting outside, trying and failing to look like she wasn't anxiously awaiting the outcome of my meeting with Harrington. "Lieutenant," I said calmly, "please assemble the senior staff in the main conference room at 1600 hours. There will be an important announcement." Her eyes widened slightly. "Yes, ma'am. All senior staff?" "All of them, Lieutenant, including those who might typically be excluded from such meetings." "Understood, ma'am." She hesitated, then added, "The rumor mill is already working overtime. Some are saying the general is having you arrested for cybersecurity violations." I couldn't help but smile. "The reality might be more surprising than the rumors, Lieutenant." By 1600, the main conference room was filled beyond capacity. Every senior officer on base was present, along with key technical staff and department heads. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife, with Harrington's supporters gathered in tight clusters, shooting suspicious glances at Torres and his cyber team. General Harrington entered last, his face an unreadable mask. He took position at the front of the room, but made no move to speak. All eyes turned to me as I stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for assembling on short notice. I have 2 announcements to make, both effective immediately." I paused, looking around the room at the faces that would soon be my direct responsibility. First, the demonstration conducted this morning has revealed significant security vulnerabilities in Fort Hawthorne's digital infrastructure. A full report is being prepared, but interim security measures must be implemented at once. Major Torres will coordinate this effort with full authority to access all systems and implement necessary patches and protocols. Murmurs spread through the room. Giving Torres such authority was unprecedented and would normally require Harrington's approval. Second, and more significantly, I am authorized to announce a change in command at Fort Hawthorne. The room went completely silent. Effective immediately, Brigadier General Victor Harrington is being reassigned to the Pentagon as Special Advisor on Conventional Warfare Doctrine, where his extensive experience will help shape the integration of traditional and modern military approaches. All eyes shifted to Harrington, who stood rigidly at attention, his expression stoic. Also effective immediately, I will be assuming command of Fort Hawthorne, with a promotion to Brigadier General to be formalized next week. The silence that followed was absolute. I could see shock, confusion, and in some faces, barely concealed outrage. Harrington's most loyal officers looked as though they'd been physically struck. I recognize that this announcement comes as a surprise to most of you. Change always brings uncertainty. But let me be clear about my intentions as your new commanding officer. I moved to stand beside Harrington, a gesture of respect for his position, even as I prepared to assume it. Fort Hawthorne has a proud tradition of excellence in conventional warfare, a tradition built and maintained under General Harrington's leadership. That tradition will continue, but it must evolve to include excellence in all domains of modern conflict, including cyber, information, and electronic warfare. I looked directly at the officers I knew to be Harrington's strongest supporters. I am not here to dismantle what works or to dismiss the value of experience. I am here to ensure that Fort Hawthorne remains at the forefront of military effectiveness. In a rapidly changing battlefield environment, that will require adaptation, integration, and yes, some discomfort as we learn new approaches. I turned to face Harrington. "General, would you like to address the staff?" It was a risk, giving him the floor at this moment. He could undermine me, challenge the orders, or signal to his loyalists that resistance was appropriate. Instead, he surprised me. "As soldiers, we follow orders," he said simply. "Colonel Chen, soon to be General Chen, has her orders. As do I. Fort Hawthorne will continue its mission under new leadership. I expect every officer and enlisted person on this base to provide the same level of professional support to Colonel Chen that you have provided to me." With that, he saluted me formally. "The base is yours, Colonel." I returned his salute. "Thank you, General Harrington." As the meeting dispersed, the atmosphere was charged with confusion and speculation. I had no illusions about the challenges ahead. Harrington's public endorsement was professional but hardly enthusiastic, and many of his loyal officers would resist change at every turn. Yet something significant had happened, not just the transfer of command, but the beginning of a necessary evolution. Fort Hawthorne would never be the same, and neither would I. The real work was just beginning. The morning after the announcement, I arrived at what was now my office before dawn. The commander's suite at Fort Hawthorne was imposing, wood-paneled walls covered with historical photographs, a massive desk that had served 6 previous commanders, and windows overlooking the parade grounds where generations of soldiers had trained. Harrington had already removed his personal items, leaving behind only official furnishings and military memorabilia that belonged to the base. As I set down my briefcase, I noticed a single envelope on the otherwise empty desk. My name was written on it in Harrington's distinctive handwriting. Inside was a short note. "The first day is the hardest. They're watching for weakness. Don't show any. VH." It wasn't exactly a warm welcome, but it was honest advice. I tucked the note into my pocket just as a knock came at the door. "Enter," I called, consciously adopting the authoritative tone befitting my new position. EOD training in the South Compound, bridge construction simulation in the main yard, and our technical specialists are troubleshooting the new terrain mapping systems in the command center. Perfect. Let's start with the EOD training and work our way around. For the next 2 hours, I observed the engineers at work, occasionally asking questions of both officers and enlisted personnel, but mostly watching how they operated. What struck me immediately was the contrast between their advanced technical equipment and their outdated communication and data integration systems. At one point, I watched a sergeant attempting to transfer crucial terrain data from a mapping system to the EOD robots, a process that involved manually translating coordinates because the systems couldn't communicate directly. "Has this compatibility issue been reported?" I asked the sergeant. "Multiple times, ma'am," he replied with barely concealed frustration. "But we're told it's not a funding priority. So we work around it." Similar stories emerged throughout the day as I visited 4 different units, sophisticated weapons, systems hampered by outdated networks, talented personnel creating manual workarounds for problems that could be solved with basic technology integration, and a pervasive sense that raising these issues was futile. By late afternoon, I had filled a notebook with observations and potential quick-win improvements that could significantly enhance operational effectiveness without major resource allocation. As we walked between facilities, Master Sergeant Diaz gradually became more forthcoming with his own insights. "The motor pool has been requesting an updated inventory management system for 3 years, he noted as we passed the vehicle maintenance area. "They're still using spreadsheets and paper. Logs for parts tracking. Wastes about 20 man-hours per week. Why hasn't it been addressed?" Diaz hesitated. General Harrington had specific priorities for technology investment. Combat systems were funded. Support systems weren't, even when they directly impacted combat readiness. "Yes, ma'am." The pattern was becoming clear. Harrington hadn't just resisted cyber warfare integration, he'd created a false dichotomy between technology and traditional military operations that hampered both. Units that could have benefited from basic digital tools were forced to create inefficient workarounds, while cyber capabilities were siloed and underutilized. Our final visit of the day was to the base hospital, where Colonel Harper had mysteriously recovered from his morning ailment and was waiting with barely concealed hostility. "Colonel Chen," he said, pointedly using my previous rank despite the change in command. "I understand you've been touring the base. I hope you found it educational." "Extremely, Colonel Harper. In fact, I'd like to discuss the network security concerns Major Torres raised this morning regarding your medical systems." Harper's expression hardened. "My primary concern is patient confidentiality and the integrity of our medical systems. Torres and his team lack the specialized knowledge to properly secure healthcare data." "A valid concern," I acknowledged. "Which is why I've arranged for a healthcare cybersecurity specialist from Walter Reed to consult with your team." They'll arrive tomorrow to ensure any security upgrades maintain HIPAA compliance and medical system integrity. Harper hadn't expected this solution, which addressed his stated concern while removing his excuse for resistance. I see. Will cooperate fully, of course. Excellent. Now I'd like to see your emergency response protocols, particularly how you communicate with field medics during training accidents. For the next hour, I observed the hospital's operations, noting the same pattern of advanced medical technology hampered by outdated information systems. When a simulated training injury came in, the response was clinically excellent but administratively cumbersome, with multiple redundant data entries and delayed information sharing. As we left the hospital, Lieutenant Rivera checked her tablet. "Ma'am, you have 14 messages from Pentagon officials seeking updates, 3 congressional inquiries about the command change, and a request from the base public affairs officer about how to handle media questions. Forward the Pentagon and congressional inquiries to my office. I'll handle them tonight. For media, standard response for now. Fort Hawthorne is undergoing a routine change of command and continuing its mission of military excellence. No additional details until we've completed our initial assessment." Rivera nodded, making notes. "Also, ma'am, there's been an incident at the Cyber Operations Center." Colonel Wells returned from his field exercise and attempted to remove some of the security upgrades Major Torres implemented. "There was a confrontation," I sighed. This was moving faster than I'd hoped. "Where is Colonel Wells now?" "In his office, ma'am. Major Torres has documented the incident and is awaiting your instructions. Tell Torres to maintain the security protocols but not to engage further with Wells. I'll handle it directly." Master Sergeant Diaz, who had been quietly observing this exchange, spoke up. "Permission to offer an observation, ma'am." "Go ahead, Master Sergeant." "Colonel Wells has significant influence with the combat arms officers. How you handle this will set the tone for your entire command." He was right, of course. This was the first direct challenge to my authority, and my response would be watched closely by everyone on base. "Thank you, Master Sergeant. I'm aware of the stakes." Colonel Wells's office was in the Operations Center, a modern facility that controlled Fort Hawthorne's training areas and simulated battle space. I found him at his desk, reviewing documents with pointed intensity that didn't quite mask his awareness of my arrival. "Colonel Wells," I said from the doorway, "do you have a moment?" He stood reluctantly. "General Chen, I was planning to come see you tomorrow about the unauthorized changes to my command systems." I entered his office and closed the door. "Let's discuss those changes now, Colonel. I understand you attempted to remove security protocols that were implemented under my direct authorization." Wells's jaw tightened. "With respect, ma'am, those protocols disrupted operational systems that my teams rely on. They were implemented without proper testing or integration planning. The protocols addressed critical vulnerabilities in your network security, vulnerabilities that have been flagged in 3 separate Pentagon assessments over the past year. My systems were secure against any realistic threat scenario." Wells insisted. "Torres and his team are creating solutions to problems that don't exist in operational reality." I kept my voice calm but firm. "Colonel, are you familiar with the Kazan incident last year?" Wells frowned. "The training exercise in Europe where communications failed. That was equipment malfunction." "It wasn't. It was a deliberate cyber intrusion through exactly the kind of vulnerability Torres patched in your systems today. That information is still classified, which is why the official report listed it as equipment failure. This was true. I'd been part of the response team that traced the intrusion back to a sophisticated state actor that had compromised NATO training networks." Wells looked genuinely surprised. "I wasn't aware of that." "Few people are. But it demonstrates why these security measures aren't theoretical. They're responding to actual threats our forces have already encountered." I could see Wells' recalibrating, his resistance diminishing slightly as new information challenged his assumptions. "Colonel, I understand your frustration. Changes were implemented in your area of responsibility without your direct involvement. That's not how I intend to operate going forward. But the security vulnerabilities were critical enough to warrant immediate action. Then why wasn't I briefed on the specific threats?" Wells asked, still defensive but now engaging on substance. "Rather than authority. Because I've been here for less than 24 hours, and we're still establishing proper communication protocols. That's on me, and I take responsibility for it." My willingness to acknowledge the legitimate procedural issues seemed to surprise him. "Moving forward," I continued, "I want your direct involvement in any changes to your operational systems. Your expertise is valuable and necessary. But the security protocols will remain in place, and future vulnerability assessments will be conducted with your team's participation." Wells studied me for a moment, clearly reassessing his position. "That's reasonable, ma'am. I'll work with Torres to ensure the protocols don't impede critical operations." "Thank you, Colonel. And I'd appreciate your insights on how we can better integrate cybersecurity with operational requirements across the base. Your perspective from the operations side would be invaluable." By explicitly requesting his expertise, I was offering Wells a path to cooperation that preserved his professional dignity. He seemed to recognize the olive branch for what it was. "I might have some thoughts on that, ma'am. Particularly regarding our joint training scenarios." "Excellent. Please prepare a briefing for our strategy session next week, and Colonel, I expect all officers under my command to address concerns through appropriate channels, not by unilaterally reversing authorized directives." The reprimand was mild but clear. This type of resistance wouldn't be tolerated going forward. "Understood, ma'am. It won't happen again." As I left Wells's office, I found Master Sergeant Diaz waiting outside, his expression unreadable. "Crisis averted?" he asked quietly as we walked down the corridor. "For now. But there will be others." "Yes, ma'am, there will. But word spreads fast on a military base. How you handled Wells will make the next one easier." By the time I returned to my office that evening, the day's events had left me mentally exhausted but strategically energized. The challenges were significant but not insurmountable. Fort Hawthorne had excellent personnel and capabilities, but was hampered by artificial divisions between traditional and technological warfare domains. As I reviewed Torres's cybersecurity briefing and prepared responses to Pentagon inquiries, I realized that the path forward was becoming clearer. Fort Hawthorne didn't need a revolution, it needed integration. The strengths Harrington had built could be preserved while addressing the weaknesses he had ignored. I worked late into the night, drafting a preliminary assessment and action plan based on the day's observations. As I finally prepared to leave, I noticed a small group of officers lingering in the headquarters building despite the late hour. Among them were Major Jackson from engineering, 2 captains from the intelligence division, and surprisingly, Colonel Richards from logistics. "Is there something I can help you with?" I asked as I approached them. They exchanged glances before Major Jackson spoke. "Ma'am, we wanted to offer our support for your modernization initiatives. Many of us have been advocating for these changes for years. Without much success, I imagine." "That's putting it mildly, ma'am," one of the intelligence captains said. "Some of us had career advancement blocked because we pushed too hard for technological integration." Colonel Richards, the most senior officer present, looked uncomfortable, but determined. "General Harrington built an excellent fighting force, ma'am. But the world has changed, and we need to change with it. Some of us recognize that, even if we weren't in a position to say so until now." It was a small gesture, but a significant one. My first indication that there was indeed a constituency for change at Fort Hawthorne, not just resistance. These officers were taking a professional risk by openly aligning with my initiative so early in my command. "I appreciate your support," I told them. "But I'm not looking to create factions on this base. My goal is integration, bringing together traditional strengths and technological capabilities to make Fort Hawthorne more effective. I'll need advocates who can bridge those worlds, not just champion one side." "That's why we're here, ma'am," Jackson replied. "Most of us have served in both conventional and technical roles. We understand both languages." "Then I'll count on you to help translate," I said with a smile. "Now go home. Tomorrow's going to be another full day." As I drove to my temporary quarters, I reflected on how much had happened in just 24 hours. I'd faced resistance, yes, but also found potential allies. I'd identified specific problems and potential solutions. Most importantly, I'd begun to chart a course that respected Fort Hawthorne's traditions while moving it firmly toward the future. Harrington had been right about one thing: the first day was indeed the hardest. But it had also revealed that the task ahead, while challenging, was not impossible. Fort Hawthorne could change without losing its identity. The key was making that vision clear to everyone, from the most reluctant colonel to the most junior enlisted soldier. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time since receiving this assignment, I felt confident that success was possible. Not just my personal success as a commander, but success for the mission, creating a military installation that truly represented the best of both worlds, traditional and technological, integrated into a single powerful fighting force. 3 months passed with the intensity and momentum of a military operation. Each day brought new challenges as I worked to transform Fort Hawthorne without breaking what already functioned well. The resistance I'd encountered in those first days hadn't disappeared, but it had evolved from outright obstruction to skeptical cooperation in most quarters. On this particular morning, I stood at the edge of the base's largest training field, watching a remarkable sight, a joint exercise that would have been impossible under Harrington's command. Infantry units moved across the terrain in coordinated patterns, their movements informed by real-time drone surveillance and cyber intelligence provided by Torres's team. Engineers deployed adaptive barriers guided by terrain analysis systems, while medical units practiced evacuation procedures enhanced by battlefield health monitoring technology. Master Sergeant Diaz stood beside me, his weathered face showing grudging approval. "Never thought I'd see this at Fort Hawthorne," he said quietly. "Combat arms and tech specialists actually working together instead of competing for resources." "It's not perfect yet," I replied, noting several communication delays and integration issues, "but it's progress." "More than progress, ma'am. 3 months ago, Colonel Wells wouldn't let Torres's cyber team within 100 yards of his operations center. Now they're running joint simulations every week." I smiled at the memory of that early confrontation with Wells. After our initial clash, he had surprised everyone by becoming one of the most engaged participants in our integration efforts. Once he understood that cyber capabilities could enhance, rather than replace his traditional expertise, his resistance had transformed into innovation. "General Chen," Lieutenant Rivera called as she approached, tablet in hand. "The Pentagon conference call is in 15 minutes, and General Marshall is already online." "Thank you, Lieutenant. I'll be right there." As I turned to leave, Diaz spoke again. "Ma'am, the troops are talking about your 100-day assessment. Word is you're sending it to the Pentagon today." "That's correct, Master Sergeant." "Any concerns I should address before it's finalized?" Diaz hesitated. "Not concerns exactly, just there's a lot of interest in what you're reporting about the future of Fort Hawthorne. People have gotten used to the changes, started to see the benefits. There's anxiety about whether the Pentagon will support continuing the integration programs." His comment revealed how much had changed. The same personnel who had initially resisted my appointment now worried about reverting to the old ways of operating. The report will be shared with all department heads once it's submitted, I assured him. No secrets about where we stand or where we're headed. Back in my office, I connected to the secure video conference with the Pentagon. General James Marshall, Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, appeared on the screen along with several other senior officers. Marshall had been Harrington's longtime friend and supporter, and while he'd never openly opposed my appointment, his skepticism had been evident in our previous interactions. General Chen, Marshall began, his tone formal. The Joint Chiefs are looking forward to your 100-day assessment. Before you submit the final document, we wanted to discuss any significant findings or recommendations. Thank you, General Marshall. I'll be submitting the full report by end of day, but I'm happy to provide an overview now. For the next 20 minutes, I detailed the changes implemented at Fort Hawthorne and the results achieved, enhanced training outcomes, improved readiness metrics, and most significantly, the successful integration of conventional and technological warfare capabilities. I also outlined challenges that remained and resources needed to address them. Marshall listened with a neutral expression. When I finished, he asked the question I'd been expecting. And what about the concerns that Fort Hawthorne's combat effectiveness would be compromised by this focus on technological integration? Those concerns haven't materialized, General. In fact, our latest readiness assessments show improvement in conventional capabilities alongside new cyber proficiencies. The combined arms exercise you're seeing today demonstrates that integration. Marshall studied me for a moment. And the personnel situation? We received several transfer requests from senior officers immediately after the change of command. This was true. 5 of Harrington's most loyal colonels had requested reassignment rather than serve under my command. All had been granted. Transfers without prejudice. Those transfers were anticipated and managed without operational impact, I replied. More telling is that we've had a 20% increase in retention among junior officers and technical specialists, reversing a concerning trend from previous years. One of the other Pentagon officials spoke up. We've also noted the increase in cross-training participation. Your report indicates over 60% of combat personnel have now completed basic cyber awareness certification. Correct. And 40% of our technical specialists have completed field operations training. The goal is to create a force where everyone understands both domains, even while maintaining their specialized expertise. The questioning continued for another half hour, probing every aspect of the changes at Fort Hawthorne. Finally, Marshall leaned forward. General Chen, I'll be honest. When you were appointed to replace Victor Harrington, I had serious reservations. Fort Hawthorne has a proud tradition of conventional warfare excellence. I feared that would be sacrificed in pursuit of technological trendiness. I kept my expression neutral, waiting for him to continue. Based on the preliminary data and your briefing today, it appears those concerns were not entirely justified. You've managed to enhance Fort Hawthorne's capabilities while preserving its core strengths. That's commendable. Thank you, General. It's been a team effort, Marshall nodded. Submit your formal report as planned. The Joint Chiefs will review it next week, but I don't anticipate any significant issues. Fort Hawthorne appears to be on the right track. After the call ended, I sat back in my chair, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. Pentagon support meant continued resources for our integration initiatives and validation of our approach. It wasn't complete victory. Marshall's approval had been measured rather than enthusiastic, but it was sufficient to secure our path forward. Lieutenant Rivera appeared at my door. How did it go, ma'am? Better than expected. There. Cautiously supportive. That's excellent news. The department heads have been asking when you'll brief them on the Pentagon's response. Schedule a meeting for tomorrow morning. Full transparency on where we stand and what comes next. As Rivera left to make arrangements, my secure phone rang with an unexpected caller, ID General Victor Harrington. General Chen, Harrington's voice was as crisp as ever. "I understand you presented your preliminary assessment to Marshall today." Word traveled fast in Pentagon circles. "That's correct, General Harrington. The formal report will be submitted this afternoon." Marshall briefed me on the highlights. "It seems Fort Hawthorne hasn't collapsed into digital chaos under your command, as some predicted." Coming from Harrington, this qualified as high praise. "We've worked hard to integrate new capabilities while maintaining the strengths you built during your command." There was a pause before Harrington continued. "I've been following the readiness reports. Your combined arms exercise today actually exceeded the performance metrics from my final year in command." This was an extraordinary admission from a man who had predicted my failure in no uncertain terms. The exercise demonstrated what's possible when we stop treating conventional and cyber operations as competing priorities. "Yes, well," Harrington cleared his throat. "That's actually why I'm calling. The Joint Chiefs have asked me to chair a working group on integrated warfare doctrine, drawing lessons from Fort Hawthorne and similar initiatives. They suggested you might have insights to contribute." I almost laughed at the irony. Harrington, the great skeptic of cyber integration, now leading doctrine development in that very area. But his call represented something significant: acknowledgement that the changes at Fort Hawthorne were not just successful, but potentially transformative for the broader military. "I'd be happy to contribute, General. Perhaps you could visit Fort Hawthorne to see the integration in action. It might provide valuable context for the working group." Another pause. "That's not a bad idea, actually. It would be educational to see these changes firsthand. We'd welcome your expertise and perspective." After the call ended, I found myself smiling at the turn of events. Harrington's grudging interest in our work represented the beginning of a much larger transformation, one that could extend far beyond Fort Hawthorne to influence military doctrine across all services. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity: finalizing the 100-day assessment, reviewing personnel recommendations from department heads, and dealing with the myriad administrative details that came with command responsibility. By evening, I was ready for a break from the office. Instead of heading to my quarters, I made my way to the base fitness center where a different kind of integration was taking place. 3 months earlier, I had initiated a series of informal combatives training sessions that brought together personnel from across different units and specialties. What had started as a team-building exercise had evolved into a popular after-hours tradition. As I entered the gymnasium, I found about 30 soldiers, a mix of infantry, intelligence, cyber specialists, and support personnel, engaged in various martial arts training scenarios. Major Torres was demonstrating a takedown technique to a young infantry sergeant, while Colonel Wells coached a group of technical specialists on defensive stances. Master Sergeant Diaz, who had become the unofficial leader of these sessions, noticed my arrival. "General on deck," he called, and the room immediately came to attention. "As you were," I said quickly. "I'm just here to train, not inspect." The sessions resumed, and I joined a group practicing jiu-jitsu techniques. As I worked with a young lieutenant from the Signals Division, I reflected on how these training sessions had become a microcosm of what we were trying to achieve across the base: breaking down artificial barriers between different specialties, creating mutual respect through shared experience, and building a unified team from previously siloed groups. After an hour of rigorous training, I sat on a bench catching my breath when Colonel Wells approached and sat beside me. "Good session, ma'am," he said, wiping sweat from his face with a towel. "Your armbar technique is getting better." "Hi." Praise coming from you, Colonel. Wells had been a collegiate wrestler and brought that intensity to our combative sessions. More surprisingly, he'd become one of the strongest advocates for integration after his initial resistance. "Heard your call with the Pentagon went well," he said casually. "News really did travel at the speed of light on a military base." "It did. They're supportive of our direction." Wells nodded. "Good. the troops have noticed the improvements. Even the old guard has to admit things are working better now. Speaking of the old guard, I said, Harrington called me today. He's heading up a working group on integrated warfare doctrine and may visit to see our operations firsthand. Wells let out a low whistle. Never thought I'd see that day. Harrington visiting to learn about cyber integration? The man who once said computers were administrative tools, not weapons of war? People can change their perspectives when presented with compelling evidence. Some people, Wells amended. Not everyone is as adaptable as Harrington apparently is. You should know, there's still a faction here that resents the changes. Not as vocal as before, but still present. I'm aware. Change is never universal or immediate. We focus on results and let them speak for themselves. Wells was quiet for a moment, then spoke with unusual candor. I should apologize, ma'am. I was part of that resistance initially. I thought you were here to dismantle everything we'd built. To turn Fort Hawthorne into some kind of Silicon Valley experiment. And now? Now I see what you've been trying to do from the beginning. Not replacement, but enhancement. Making us better at what we already do well, while adding capabilities we needed but resisted. He shook his head. Wish I'd figured that out sooner. Would have saved us both some headaches. Better late than never, Colonel. And your support has been instrumental in bringing others along. As the training session wound down, I noticed a group of junior officers and NCOs gathering near the door, clearly waiting for an opportunity to speak with me. This had become another unofficial tradition, informal access to the commanding general in a setting where rank seemed less imposing. I made my way over to them. Something on your minds? A young sergeant from the intelligence division spoke. Ma'am, we heard rumors that some of our integration programs might be featured in the next Army Doctrine publication. Is that true? It's possible. General Harrington is heading a working group on integrated warfare doctrine and our experiences. Here will certainly inform their work. This news caused visible excitement among the group. For junior personnel who had embraced the integration initiatives, the prospect of their work influencing Army-wide doctrine was powerful validation. That's outstanding, ma'am, the sergeant continued. Some of us were worried that when you eventually got reassigned, everything would go back to the old way of doing things. It was a legitimate concern. Military leadership changes regularly, and new commanders often have different priorities. That's why documentation and institutionalization are so important, I explained. We're not just changing practices, we're establishing new standards, training protocols, and evaluation metrics. Those endure beyond any individual commander. As I walked back to my quarters that evening, I reflected on how much had changed in 3 months. The resistance that had seemed so formidable on my first day had largely transformed into collaboration. Personnel who had viewed each other with suspicion or disdain now trained together, planned together, and respected each other's contributions. Most importantly, Fort Hawthorne was evolving into a model for what the future military could be. One that leveraged both human courage and technological capability, traditional fighting spirit, and digital innovation. The next morning, I convened the department heads to brief them on the Pentagon's response and our path forward. The conference room that had once been filled with hostile stares now held a mix of committed allies and constructive partners. Even those who had initially opposed my appointment now engaged professionally with our initiatives. The Pentagon has reviewed our preliminary assessment and supports our direction, I began. They're particularly interested in how we've improved readiness, metrics across both conventional and cyber domains simultaneously. Colonel Richards, who had become an unexpected advocate for integration, spoke up. What about resource allocation? For the next fiscal year, will we maintain the balanced approach between traditional and technological investments? Yes, the budget proposal maintains that balance, with increased funding for cross-training programs and integrated exercise development. Major Jackson raised her hand. Ma'am, what about the pilot program for technical specialists to complete? Abbreviated field training? Will that continue? This had been one of our more controversial initiatives, creating a pathway for cyber personnel to gain practical field experience without compromising their specialized focus. Not only will it continue, but the Pentagon is considering adopting it as a model for all technical branches. Your documentation of the program's impact has been particularly helpful, Major. The briefing continued for another hour, covering everything from training schedules to personnel policies to strategic planning. Throughout the discussion, I was struck by how the conversation had evolved from resistance versus change to collaborative problem-solving. Department heads who had once defended their turf now routinely suggested ways to better integrate with other units. As the meeting concluded, Colonel Wells asked the question that was likely on everyone's mind. Ma'am, there's been talk about General Harrington visiting Fort Hawthorne. Is that confirmed? It is. General Harrington will be visiting next month as part of his work on integrated warfare doctrine. He's interested in seeing our operations firsthand. A murmur ran through the room. For many of these officers, Harrington had been a mentor and commanding officer for years. His return as an observer rather than commander would be a significant moment. I expect everyone to demonstrate the highest standards of professionalism during his visit, I continued. This isn't about vindicating our approach or criticizing the past. It's about sharing lessons learned that can benefit the broader military. After the meeting dispersed, Lieutenant Rivera approached with a message. Ma'am, General Marshall called while you were in the briefing. He asked you to return his call at your earliest convenience. In my office, I connected with Marshall. On the secure line, General Chen, he greeted me. I've reviewed your formal report. The Joint Chiefs are impressed with the progress at Fort Hawthorne. Thank you, sir. It's been a team effort. Indeed, which brings me to the purpose of my call. The Army is establishing a new Center for Integrated Warfare at Fort Benning. Given your success at Fort Hawthorne, you're being considered to lead this initiative with promotion to Major General. The offer was unexpected and significant, a major career advancement and an opportunity to expand the integration model beyond Fort Hawthorne to influence Army-wide doctrine and training. That's an honor, sir. When would this transition occur? 6 months from now, assuming Fort Hawthorne continues on its current trajectory. That would give you time to solidify the changes there and prepare for the larger role at Benning. After the call ended, I sat in silence, processing the implications. The promotion represented validation of everything we'd accomplished at Fort Hawthorne. Yet I felt unexpectedly conflicted about leaving just as our initiatives were bearing fruit. A knock at my door interrupted my thoughts. Master Sergeant Diaz entered with a folder of documents requiring my signature. Everything all right, ma'am? He asked, noticing my expression. I decided on transparency. I've just been offered command of the new Center for Integrated Warfare at Fort Benning, with promotion to Major General. Diaz's eyebrows rose. Congratulations, ma'am. That's well deserved. Thank you, Master Sergeant. It would mean leaving Fort Hawthorne in 6 months. Diaz considered this. 6 months is enough time to ensure the changes here are irreversible. And influencing Army-wide doctrine would magnify the impact of what you've started here. His assessment mirrored my own thinking. True, but I hadn't expected to feel reluctant about leaving. That's the mark of a good commander, ma'am. Caring about the mission and the people enough to worry about what happens when you're gone. Diaz placed the folder on my desk. For what it's worth, what you've built here won't disappear when you leave. It's become part of how we operate now. That afternoon, I toured several units to observe ongoing operations and check on the progress of our integration initiatives. Everywhere I went, I saw evidence of the transformation. Infantry officers consulting with cyber specialists on mission planning, technical personnel participating in field exercises, and a general atmosphere of collaborative problem-solving rather than territorial competition. At the Cyber Operations Center, I found Major Torres and his team working alongside Colonel Wells's operations staff, jointly developing scenarios for the upcoming readiness evaluation. 3 months earlier, these two groups had barely communicated. Now they operated as a unified team. "General," Torres greeted me, "we were just finalizing the integrated defense scenario. Colonel Wells had some excellent suggestions for making the simulation more realistic." Wells nodded, and Torres's team found ways to incorporate cyber effects that actually enhance rather than complicate the ground commander's decision cycle. It's a breakthrough in how we model these operations. Their enthusiasm was genuine and infectious. These weren't just officers following orders, they were innovators who had discovered the power of combining their different perspectives and expertise. As I completed my rounds and returned to headquarters, I found Lieutenant Rivera waiting, with news that brought the day's events full circle. "Ma'am, we've just received confirmation of General Harrington's visit. He'll be here 3 weeks from now, staying for 3 days to observe our integrated operations." "Thank you, Lieutenant. Please ensure all department heads are notified. And begin preparations." "Already done, ma'am." "And there's one more thing. General Harrington specifically requested a private meeting with you upon his arrival." This was intriguing. Did he indicate the purpose? "No, ma'am. Just that he had matters of professional importance to discuss." That evening, I worked late finalizing plans for the next phase of our integration efforts. With potential promotion and reassignment on the horizon, I needed to ensure that Fort Hawthorne's transformation would continue regardless of who assumed command after me. As I looked out my office window at the base, illuminated by evening lights, I reflected on the journey of the past 3 months. From that first morning briefing where Harrington had humiliated me, not knowing I would soon be his replacement, to today's news of potential promotion, it had been a path of continuous challenge and unexpected reward. The resistance I'd faced hadn't been personal, though it had often felt that way. It had been institutional, cultural, the natural resistance of any established system to significant change. By acknowledging the value in what already existed while insisting on necessary evolution, we had found a path forward that preserved strengths while addressing weaknesses. Fort Hawthorne today was neither Harrington's traditional bastion nor a purely technological outpost. It was something new and more powerful, an integrated fighting force that leveraged both human courage and technological advantage, traditional military virtues, and innovative capabilities. As I gathered my things to finally head home, I paused at a photo newly hung on the office wall, a group picture from our most recent integrated exercise, showing personnel from across all specialties working as a unified team. It wasn't just a record of a successful training event. It was evidence of a cultural transformation that would endure beyond any individual's command. That transformation was the real victory, not my personal vindication or career advancement, but the creation of something that would continue to evolve and improve long after I moved on to my next assignment. Fort Hawthorne had changed me, as much as I had changed it, teaching me that effective leadership wasn't about imposing my vision, but about building something collaborative that could outlast my tenure. In 3 weeks, Harrington would return to the base he had commanded for years, now transformed in ways he had once resisted. His visit would mark the closing of a circle, not an ending, but the completion of one cycle in an ongoing evolution. Whatever he wanted to discuss in our private meeting, I was ready to engage as a professional colleague rather than an adversary or victor. The military had always evolved through cycles of tradition and innovation, resistance and change. Fort Hawthorne's story was just one chapter in that larger narrative, a chapter that demonstrated how integration rather than competition between different capabilities created something stronger than either could achieve alone. As I finally left headquarters and walked through the quiet evening base, I passed soldiers from different units talking easily together, sharing experiences and perspectives that would have been siloed just months earlier. That, more than any promotion or recognition, was the true measure of what we had accomplished together. The general had humiliated me at that first morning briefing, never knowing I was his new commander. But the story hadn't been about humiliation or revenge. It had been about transformation, both personal and institutional. Now Fort Hawthorne stood as a model for the future military, and I had found my own path as a leader who could bridge worlds that once seemed incompatible. The challenges ahead would be different, but no less significant. Expanding this model to influence Army-wide doctrine would meet new forms of resistance and require new approaches. But the lessons of Fort Hawthorne would guide that effort: respect tradition while embracing innovation, acknowledge expertise across all domains, and focus on integration rather than replacement. That balance was the key to everything we had accomplished, and everything still to be done. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.